Hey, Southern Nightmare fans. Before we begin this final episode... Oh, sorry, I forgot to turn off my phone. Do you like my new ringtone? The Southern Nightmare theme is now available as a ringtone on the iTunes Store and the Tunes Ring Store. So, as I was saying, before we begin this final chapter of the Southside Strangler story, I want to thank all of you for listening and for making Southern Nightmare such a success. We now have listeners in all 50 states and more than 95 countries around the world. We even made the iTunes Top 100 podcast chart. So thanks again, and please keep telling your friends about us. Now it's time for the conclusion of Season 1 of Southern Nightmare.
The following program contains mature content about crimes involving rape, murder, and sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised.
Previously on Southern Nightmare.
There's no doubts in my mind at all that the DNA results point to Timothy Spencer and no one else.
Legendary FBI profiler John Douglas wanted to interview Timothy Spencer. The man who coined the term serial killer had already questioned a legion of infamous monsters like Ted Bundy, David Berkowitz, Edmund Kemper, and John Wayne Gacy, learning their methods and psychology so that law enforcement could develop techniques for catching other serial murderers. The Netflix TV series Mindhunter and a character in the Oscar-winning film The Silence of the Lambs are both based on Douglas's life and work. And despite all of his experience and impressive credentials, his interview request was turned down flat by Spencer's attorneys. So Virginia State Police Senior Special Agent Larry McCann and FBI profiler Steve Mardigian decided they would try a slightly different approach.
Well, maybe we didn't ask. I don't think we asked. Why bother to ask? We arrived unannounced at death row.
That's Larry McCann. Now retired and bravely battling ALS, Larry studied serial killers at the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, and he was the first profiler in the Virginia State Police's Violent Crimes Unit. He and Mardigian had worked on and off for a year, plotting out how and when they would make their own attempt to interview Spencer and get him talking about the Southside Strangler killings. They waited until April 1997, a week before Spencer was sentenced to die in Virginia's electric chair, before they showed up on death row at Greensville Correctional Center. A Richmond judge had just ruled against Spencer's last-ditch attempt to call the DNA testing into question.
But we impressed on him immediately that we knew he was going to die within the week, and we wanted to let him know that he was going to die within the week, because that's the time, if you're ever going to tell a big secret, if you're ever going to tell the truth, that's when it'll come out. As Dante said, abandon hope, all ye who enter here. So we waited as late as we thought prudent, and that's when we went in, when all hope was gone, and he knew he was going to die. As I recall, he was handcuffed in front, and so I shook his hand, and I remember that he had the longest fingers of anyone I'd ever met. Incredibly long fingers. And while I was shaking his hand as we arrived and when we departed, I thought about the necks those fingers had been around, and how many terrified women those fingers had assaulted. And we sat down, the three of us, and we talked, and he gave us nothing. zero, zip, nothing.
From True South Media in Richmond, Virginia, in cooperation with Style Weekly and WRIR 97.3 FM Richmond Independent Radio, this is Southern Nightmare, the story of how the Southside Strangler was brought to justice. I'm your host, Richard Foster. Steve Mardigian says that he and Larry McCann tried every tool in their toolbox, but Spencer just wasn't having it. Possibly because his lawyers were still hoping to obtain a stay of execution from the Virginia Supreme Court.
It looked like he might, at least have a conversation with Larry, but then once he really understood our purpose there, he just, he could care less whether he helped us in any capacity. And he shut the interview down.
But you take your shot. I mean, we've been into institutions. We interviewed a lot of criminals that would talk to us. Some very successful ones, and that's what we really helped to develop the profiling field. Some do and some don't.
And we tried every one of the scenarios we had posited for the last year. We tried every one. We can't save you. You're going to die. But we may be able to stop the next kid from going down this path. Tim, help us help this kid. Well, I don't know anything. What he said over and over was, I didn't hurt anybody.
I saw him as defiant, arrogant, angry. I mean, these are the adjectives that come to mind, if I recall correctly. And he was obstinate, kind of he was like, "You're a cop. I don't have to talk to you," And we tried a number of different, if I recall, approaches to try to get the guy to open up and give us some insight into his. Because he was still, right to the end, I think he challenged it all, and, he was an innocent. For him, he wasn't going to ever admit that he did these things. But, of course, the evidence was so overwhelming, the blood work, the physical evidence, the DNA. There was just no way he could challenge that. That was all new, and no one knew about that back then. It was like, science fiction stuff. And it's always been tough being the first guy, you can't, but he was one.
In the years following Spencer's conviction, Bill and Joe Dudley, the parents of Southside Strangler victim Debbie Davis, filed a $9 million lawsuit against Offender Aid and Restoration Incorporated, the nonprofit organization that ran the halfway house where Timothy Spencer lived during his fall 1987 killing spree. Spencer was in a program that was supposed to help recently released felons transition to leading a productive life on the outside. But as the Dudleys' lawsuit pointed out, Spencer should never have been in the halfway house to begin with. Timothy Spencer had been in and out of trouble with the law since age 9, when he was first arrested on charges of larceny and arson. Arrested over and over again from ages 11 to 16, he served 2 stretches in juvenile correctional centers. By age 19, Spencer was sent to the Virginia State Penitentiary for 6 months. Just 1 month after his release, he was promptly arrested on 3 new burglary charges. And he was sent back to prison until March 1983, 3 months before the masked rapist attacks began in Arlington. After Spencer was imprisoned on breaking and entering charges in 1984, he joined in the brutal group assault of 2 inmates who were threatened with rape if they reported the attack to prison officials. Prison psychologists deemed Spencer a potential discipline and security problem, describing him as lazy, greedy, self-indulgent, directionless, uncooperative, and unreliable. Citing his long history of criminal offenses, the state parole board refused to grant him early release, considering it an unacceptable risk. Timothy Spencer wasn't supposed to get out of prison until 1991, but somehow he slipped through the cracks and ended up being released to the Hospitality House in Richmond, in walking distance from the homes of Debbie Davis and Dr. Susan Helms in summer 1987. Spencer didn't meet any of the parole requirements for living at the halfway house, which also wasn't supposed to take inmates with a history of violence. Because residents were still considered to be in the prison system, the halfway house was supposed to monitor them and ensure they obeyed restrictions such as not possessing weapons. As the lawsuit notes, even though the halfway house was under contract with the Department of Corrections, security there was non-existent. It primarily consisted of an honor system with a sign-in sheet and head counts. In fact, the lawsuit charged that 3 of the 4 halfway house employees who were supposed to be supervising the inmates were themselves former convicted criminals with histories of prostitution, burglary, and malicious wounding. Residents were supposed to obey a mandatory curfew, but Spencer came and went, more or less as he pleased. His bedroom window opened onto a fire escape, and he often left to spend the night with a local girlfriend. The night he murdered Debbie Davis, Timothy Spencer wasn't present during the 7 p.m. head count. He signed back in at 12:30 a.m., marking himself down as late. No one asked where he'd been. The state required the halfway house to notify the Department of Corrections if an inmate was absent without leave for more than 2 hours. The halfway house never filed a report. Even more incredibly, halfway house employees helped Spencer break the rules. He was supposed to be prohibited from driving, but he frequently borrowed a car from a halfway house employee. Police believe he used that car to get back and forth from the murder of 15-year-old Diane Cho. Spencer killed his final victim, Sue Tucker, when the halfway house gave him a furlough to visit his family in Arlington over Thanksgiving weekend, 1987. Offender Aid and Restoration settled Bill and Joe Dudley's lawsuit for an undisclosed sum, and the city government shut down the halfway house. Attorney and retired Chesterfield County Circuit Court Judge Mike Allen represented the Dudleys in their lawsuit.
There was no amount of money that could ever adequately compensate them for the loss of their daughter, and particularly for the horrendous manner of her death. She was their only child. I hope they received some manner of satisfaction at having been vindicated through the legal process to the extent they could be. I think Mr. Davis did experience that. Mrs. Davis, I think, was so grief-stricken that she was virtually a shell of a person at that time. And so, I'm not sure that the result of the lawsuit, frankly, gave her a great deal of solace.
Debbie's cousin, Judy Fisk, remembers that the lawsuit didn't bring her aunt and uncle any peace, but they felt strongly that it was the right thing to do.
And the lawsuit was really, really important to Bill, not for money, but for you ought not to let this stuff happen. He was always sad and angry. He was not happy. Very angry that something like this could happen. It took the peace out of his final years because he was angry and felt like something that he really loved had been taken. Something he really loved had been taken away from him. He'd counted on having Debbie to be around, and they were best buddies. So, I think he felt that big hole in his life from then on. And, there was talk about putting another halfway house in our neighborhood recently in Westover Hills, and it was like, I don't think so.
Around the same time as the lawsuit, in 1990, just a year after Spencer's final murder trial, a computer analyst working at the Virginia Chief Medical Examiner's office in Richmond published her debut mystery novel. A thinly veiled account of the Southside Strangler killings, the best-selling book was called Postmortem, and its author, Patricia Cornwell, would go on to become one of the most famous crime and mystery writers in the world. She has sold more than 100 million copies of her books and has written 29 New York Times bestsellers. Ironically, Style Weekly employee Debbie Davis who was the Stranglers' first Richmond victim, was an avid mystery reader and probably would have been a big fan of Cornwell's novels, which have gone on to influence pretty much every movie and TV show you can think of today that features medical examiners and forensics work. Cornwell received numerous awards for Postmortem, which launched both her career and the series of books based around her famous heroine, Dr. Kay Scarpetta. A tough-talking, chain-smoking, brilliant chief medical examiner with a compulsion to chase the truth, Scarpetta was based on Cornwell's boss at the time, Dr. Marcella Fierro. For her part, Dr. Fierro usually deflects questions about Scarpetta with a joke. This is what she had to say about it when she appeared on the PBS documentary series Frontline in 2011.
Is that you?
Is that me? Am I blonde, blue-eyed, and 105 pounds?
I refuse to comment.
But Dr. Fierro has also said that she was impressed that Cornwell, a former newspaper crime reporter, took the time and effort to get the science and the authentic details of forensic pathology correct in her novels.
Yeah, she's a terrific writer, and she did masterful work there. Her book is really, really well written, and it's just a nail-biter. Dr. Fierro was just a remarkable person. I think anybody who spent more than 20 minutes in her company would realize that immediately. And for a medical examiner, she was funny, and she was sharp, and she was just and a great raconteur. And I think being around anybody like that would have really given you an insight into this world.
That's author and attorney Paul Monis. He also wrote a book about the Southside Strangler killings, but his was nonfiction. Published by Simon & Schuster in 1995, Stalking Justice is an in-depth account of the investigation, told largely from the perspective of Arlington detective Joe Horgus. Monis understands why Cornwell was drawn to this epic case and to some of the larger-than-life personalities who were a part of it.
It's still a remarkable story, and people write to me and say, wow, did all that really... Some people even say to me, did all that really happen? And I said, yeah, that all really happened in Arlington and Richmond, Virginia, over 30 years ago. What better case to prime the pump to become a crime writer? But the real story of what happened is even more amazing.
Throughout the 1990s, most Richmonders were in awe of Cornwell's meteoric rise, as her Scarpetta books topped the bestseller lists every year for more than a decade. But some family members of the Southside Stranglers' victims, like Diane Cho's brother Roman, found Postmortem disrespectful. Roman still resents Cornwell profiting from a fictional story based in part on the horrific murder of his sister.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, she can go to hell, man. To write a book so thinly based on what happened to my sister and others so soon after it happened, I just have no any kind of regard for her, and I thought it was disgusting. And it's one thing to do a book about the murders and about the Southside Strangler, but for her to make an entertainment out of it so soon after it happened, if she's going to do that, the very least she can do is explain herself. She can go to hell as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's disgusting what she did. She couldn't figure out a unique plot line. She had to take that from the headlines and take it from the headlines that's so close in terms of not only in terms of the time that has elapsed since the event, but from the same city. Come on. Talk about lack of any kind of moral compunction.
Patricia Cornwell herself spoke about her early career and postmortem in 2016 during an appearance at the University of Leicestershire in England, which coincidentally is where forensic DNA testing was pioneered in the early 1980s.
I feel a tremendous responsibility for what I share with the readers, and it's actually something I anguish over. I spend a lot of time thinking, how do I do this in a way that doesn't make it worse out there? And that's been my anguish from the time I started writing these books. I almost didn't do it because when I got to where I was about to start post-mortem, and I realized that if I was ever going to make this work, I really need to write about what I was really seeing and not make up fanciful tales about it. And I spent some real soul-searching of, but am I going to celebrate something that should be condemned? And then I said, not if you show it to people the way they need to see it, and you're going to have to make it a little bit painful, and I will do it through this character. I will make dead really dead, and I'm not going to trivialize what's done, but I'm also not going to be so graphic to the point that I'm almost inflicting further damage on everybody. And I'm not going to say that I haven't crossed the line sometimes. It's a tough balance, and I think sometimes I have, and I wish I hadn't. But it's something that is always with me. I do weigh these things out and think about them.
By April 1994, Cornwell was months away from releasing her 5th best-selling book in the Scarpetta series, The Body Farm. But the serial killer who inspired her first monstrous villain wouldn't be there to see it. Southern Nightmare will return after this message. Hey Southern Nightmare fans, we have a book coming out. You can go to Amazon.com right now to pre-order the Southern Nightmare Companion ebook, which is coming out September 15th. If you want a deeper dive into the epic story of how the Southside Strangler was brought to justice, you don't want to miss this. It's going to include lots of extra stuff we didn't have time to get to in the podcast, plus bonus content like interview transcripts and photos. And if ebooks aren't your thing, we'll also have a paperback edition coming out. Several of you have asked me about Season 2, and we definitely want to do that, but we still need your support to make it happen. If you want to hear Season 2, please visit southernnightmare.com/donate. That's southernnightmare.com/donate. Everyone who donates at the $10 or more level will get a free copy of our ebook, plus access to bonus content like extended interviews and our 1-hour live show. Thank you, everyone. And now, back to the final chapter of the Southside Strangler story.
Spencer, known as the Southside Strangler, got the death penalty 4 times for the rape, torture, and murder of 3 women in Richmond and 1 in Arlington.
Shortly before 11 p.m. on Wednesday, April 27, 1994, Timothy Wilson Spencer, the Southside Strangler, was strapped into Old Sparky, the sturdy oaken electric chair at Greensville Correctional Center. Lethal injection wasn't a choice yet. None of the family members of the Southside Strangler's victims chose to attend Spencer's execution. Neither did Arlington and Richmond homicide detectives Joe Horgus and Ray Williams. Their job was to avenge the dead, not to watch another corpse get made.
I knew it was going to happen. It seemed, and it's hazy. I think I had an invite to be there, but what the hell do I want to go there and watch somebody die for? I thought it was the right thing, and I think it was. I considered it to be swift justice. I mean, I was kind of surprised that it happened so quick, because everything I had heard was that usually death row cases go on for 20 years or more.
They called me. The warden did, Ray. We said, execution date, you want to come up here? I said, no. Why? I said, because I have mixed emotions for death penalty. I said, if anybody deserves it, he does. But I don't consider it a personal vendetta to be there to watch it. I said, we did our job. Now you do yours.
The 2 men who prosecuted Spencer for the murder of 15-year-old Diane Sho were present to witness Spencer's execution, however. Chesterfield County Commonwealth's attorney Billy Davenport and his deputy prosecutor Warren Von Schuck believed that if they sought the death penalty against a defendant, then they had a responsibility to be there to see the sentence get carried out. Spencer, now 32 years old, walked into the death chamber wearing brand new jeans with one pants leg cut off. That's so that an electrode could be attached to his bare calf with a brine-soaked sponge to increase the electrical conductivity. After he was strapped into the chair, Spencer's eyes briefly met those of both the prosecutors.
Timothy Spencer was a man who did not show fear when he entered the death chamber. He looked up and down at the chair, he rubbed his head, and looked around before he was strapped in. This was a man who betrayed no emotion when he was settled into the electric chair. When the warden asked if he had any last words, he paused for a moment, said, "Yeah, I think," looked around a little bit more, paused for about 20 seconds, and then never said anything else. And in a few moments, he was dead.
Everybody was perched for him to say something, remembers Davenport. I thought he was going to say I'm sorry or something, but he didn't say anything. Contrary to what you see in the movies, there was no switch waiting to be dramatically pulled. Instead, the executioner stood in a partition behind the chair and simply pushed a button. That set off a 45-second barrage of 2,300 volts of electricity, enough to kill a horse, as one former state executioner recently pointed out in Richmond Magazine. That was followed by a second surge of electricity, intended to ensure brain death. You could smell the burnt flesh as you're coming out of the chamber. It actually blew a bubble up on his calf, recalls Davenport, who retired this year after 30 years as Chesterfield's top prosecutor. You don't forget the smell when you come out of there. It was the second and final electrocution Davenport witnessed. Retired Richmond homicide detective Ray Williams has his own thoughts about the last words that Spencer chose instead to take to his grave.
I think y'all got the right guy.
You think that's what he was going to say?
Yep.
Officially, Timothy Spencer remained silent about his crimes right to the very end. But as it turns out, that might not be entirely true. One of Spencer's defense attorneys for the Richmond area murder trials, Jeff Everhart, later represented a former death row guard who had gotten to know Spencer.
He told me he hired me because he had watched me do the Chesterfield trial. He was there at that time. Timothy Spencer was on death row. And I told him that I had had some doubts and some concerns, and he told me, Mr. Everhart, don't. He said, I can tell you that Timothy Spencer, before he was executed, confessed to me that he had done these crimes. So don't have any doubts about what you did or didn't do, and don't have any doubts about whether y'all did the right things. And so, to me, that meant a lot. Now, is it possible he just told me that to make me feel better? I suppose it is, but that's what he said. That did make me feel better, quite frankly.
Carl Womack, who represented Timothy Spencer in his Arlington Capitol murder trial for the killing of Sue Tucker, had a similar moment years later when he was talking with a client who had grown up with Spencer.
I'll tell you, one of the things, Richard, that led me to conclude that Spencer was guilty and left me with very little doubt, or if any, actually I don't have much doubt at all. He said to me, he said, Carl, I know you represented Tim Spencer. I said, yeah. He said, Tim and I used to pull burglaries together when we were kids or young. But I stopped because whenever there was a pet, Tim killed the pet. But it just stuck with me all of these years because it's such that's one of the first things I ever read about killers, or serial killers in particular, is they start with pets.
Looking back on the Southside Strangler investigation, more than the DNA, more than the fact that it was a groundbreaking moment for forensic science and criminal justice, at its essence, it simply boiled down to a case of fine detective work, says author Paul Monis.
That is the quintessential story of American justice. It was tragic what happened to those women, and somebody had to be held responsible. And Joe did not give up, even though when he initially started investigating the case, he didn't get a great reception about his theories. Ultimately, everybody came around and realized that it was the same killer.
Because without Joe Horgus coming up with Timothy Spencer's name, and without Horgus connecting the masked rapist cases to the Southside Strangler murders, there wouldn't have been a suspect to match to the DNA samples taken from the crime scenes. And there most certainly would have been more murdered women, says former Arlington County prosecutor Helen Fahey.
Joe Horgus deserves tremendous credit for what he did, because if he hadn't had certain just instincts, I can't imagine how long it might have taken to solve the crime and prevent further murders.
It has now been more than 34 years since Timothy Spencer murdered Carolyn Hamm. And it's going on 31 years since that terror-filled fall of 1987 when the Southside Strangler stalked the streets of Richmond and Arlington, Virginia, raping and strangling Debbie Dudley Davis, Dr. Susan Helms, Diane Cho, and Sue Tucker, all in just 10 weeks. Even now, in 2018, their friends and loved ones are still dealing with the aftermath of their murders. For the ones closest to them, like Diane Cho's mother and brother, or Carolyn Hamm's sister, or Sue Tucker's husband, their lives will always be marked by that horror. All of them are glad Spencer can no longer harm anyone else, but his execution didn't bring them any closure either, says Debbie Davis's cousin, Judy Fisk.
I kind of blocked that one out. It's like, he could be gone, it's not going to bring Debbie back, so whatever.
Reg Tucker is a gentle soul who spent the 25 years after his wife Sue's murder plagued by overwhelming feelings of anger and grief. Contemplating Spencer's execution, however, he takes a surprisingly forgiving tone.
I wish that his spirit has found peace, and that if there is such a thing as reincarnation, then I would not wish him to come back the sadist that he was. So maybe he's found peace, and I would be happy about that.
On the day Spencer was executed, Debbie Davis's mother, Jo Dudley, was interviewed by local news radio station WRVA. In the 6 years following her daughter's murder, Jo's health had declined dramatically. She was haunted by the same recurring nightmare, and she hoped that Spencer's execution would finally bring her a measure of peace.
I have been keeping a journal. I've been writing to Deb every day. I hope after tonight that I can write the final chapter of her book. We had to go to all the trials, so I knew exactly what he did. They told us, and every night when I lay my head on the pillow, that would come, that dream. I'd have that same dream of what he did with her in her apartment. Same dream every night, so I want to get rid of that dream.
Jo Dudley's nightmares came to an end 7 months later, on Christmas Day, 1994, when she died from complications following heart surgery at age 68. But it was the grief that really killed her, her family told me. Because of the lasting legacy of the Southside Strangler case, more and more monsters like the Golden State Killer are being brought to justice through DNA testing. And due to DNA databanks and advances in forensic science, many violent offenders are being caught before they can escalate into becoming serial killers. And now, some nightmares will never have the chance to begin. You've been listening to the final episode of Season 1 of Southern Nightmare. Southern Nightmare is a production of True South Media in partnership with Style Weekly Magazine and WRIR 97.3 FM Richmond Independent Radio. It's recorded at Sound of Music Recording Studios in Richmond, Virginia. Our producer is John Moran. Original music by Daniel Davis. WRVA news clips are courtesy of the Library of Virginia Archives. Please remember to leave us a positive review on iTunes. It helps other people find the podcast. To get exclusive extra content like extended audio and video interviews, make a small donation to support Southern Nightmare at southernnightmare.com/donate. And we want to give a quick belated thank you to all of our most recent supporters, including Alicia Amos, Sherry Alvanen, Christine Baum, Marie Christopher, George Gallagher, Allison Gold, Catherine Hatwick, Jesse Helbert, Jackie Nutter, Carol Ann Olson, Rhonda Patillo, Rachel Pryor, and Kaylor Wallace. Finally, we'd like to give our special thanks to everyone who gave their time to talk with us for this podcast and to you for listening. Pleasant dreams.